This is what it looks like to one-shot an Archon. Crazy, right? In today's video, I will do a deep dive on Archons, the ways they employ damage reduction, and the ways we as overpowered Tenno can circumvent that damage reduction to make our lives and hunt for Archon Shards quick and easy. Archons are boss type enemies, which you can kill every week. In total, there's 3 different Archon bosses. You have Amar, who gives Crimson Archon Shards, then there's Nira, who gives Amber Archon Shards, and finally you have Boreal, who gives Azure Archon Shards. All of these Archons have exactly the same health, armor and damage reduction, so all builds shown for one-shotting them today will function the same. Now usually killing an Archon boss looks something like this, where you remove a large part of their health straight away, but after a small amount of time it takes longer and longer and your damage seems to decrease to reach an equilibrium. This is because Archons use a mechanic called damage attenuation. There are different forms of damage attenuation in the game, but for Archons, it's based on the amount of damage dealt per second. If you deal more than 495,000 damage to its health in 0.6 seconds, this damage reduction will kick in. Now, I wasn't able to find or define the exact damage reduction that's added, but for this video, this isn't important, because it's exactly this damage attenuation mechanic which we will try to bypass. The damage attenuation over time is the 3rd layer of damage reduction that Archons have. The other 2 layers are a flat 20% reduction and static damage reduction, which abides by the following formula found on the wiki. As you can see in this formula, it calculates the theoretical damage done via multishot, but we can also see this as damage instances. While this is not completely the same thing, it will be close enough for this video. Finally, on top of this, the Archons have armor that adds 36.78% damage reduction, which can't be removed. Now, I plotted all of these functions to show you how much total damage reduction changes based on your theoretical damage and multishot. What I want to reiterate before I show these is that they will mostly be based on estimations and assumptions, as the exact code for the game and the way it calculates damage reduction isn't publicly available. But let's have a look. As you can see, the damage reduction will asymptotically reduce to around 50%. However, the asymptote is reached earlier with a high multishot compared to high damage. And if we take the difference between 2 and 48 multishot, we can see a large difference appear even at high damage. Now, to one-shot an Archon, you need to remove half of its health, which is about 1.9 million HP. But if we assume that there's a 50% damage reduction that will always apply, it means that we need to deal about 3.6 to 3.8 million damage for the one-tap skip. I plotted this as well to estimate how much theoretical damage you need per damage instance to insta-kill the Archon, which is about 100,000 damage per instance from 40 instances upwards, eventually reducing to another asymptote. So to recap, if you want to one-shot Archons, the most important thing you need is 1. High damage, and 2 damage instances. Now before this we could use the Kuva hack with crit modding to bypass the damage attenuation, but this has since been fixed and the damage per instance is way too low to one-shot. So what can we now do to get both high damage and a load of damage instances? Well, usually getting high damage is not an issue, as there's many ways to do this, but the more difficult thing will be getting the damage instances for the one-shot. For these damage instances, there are 2 abilities that can provide them really easily. One is Sata's Whisper, which gives extra instances of void damage, and the other is Sever's Tornadoes, which gives extra damage instances that also carry over crit damage and status effects. Sadly, Sever's Tornadoes are not a subsume ability, which means that for a more general approach, Sata's Whisper is better. Then we also have the melee duplicate arcane, which can provide additional damage instances, but in this case you are limited to using around 100 to 150% crit chance for the optimal effect, which I personally found annoying to mod around, and thus I excluded it from my builds. Moreover, when testing duplicate, I found it to perform very similar to just going for massive crit tiers and crit damage. The weapons that can one-shot Archons depend on the type of build you are using, but for my general one-shots, the Quassus Prime is the optimal contender. The Quassus Prime is able to circumvent a lot of the damage attenuation systems from the daggers that are thrown on the heavy attack. Now, I will not go too far in depth on the Quassus, as I have a dedicated video which I suggest you watch to learn more. In all situations where I was using the Quassus for one-shots, I was using this build. Also make sure you use any companion that can trigger Tenacious Bond for an additional 1.2 times crit multiplier. To increase damage to the amount we need per damage instance, we have a couple of good options. First, we can abuse the Madurai Void Strike bonus, which is multiplicative and provides around a 10 times damage amplification. Then, if we are using the Quassus, we can abuse both the combo multiplier and the stealth multiplier on some frames at least. The way I like to stack combo multiplier just before going into the fight is by using the Rauta, which is able to increase the combo counter based on the pellets that hit hit the enemies. Modding the Rauta for fire rate and multishot easily helps you to go to a 12 times multiplier. Just make sure that you use 2 dexterity arcanes on your weapons so the multiplier lasts until you are in the fight. The secondary here doesn't really matter as long as you have the dexterity arcane as I mentioned. Now, not all frames can perform one-shot kills. On your frame, you need access to a good source of crit and you need a free slot for Zata's Whisper as a subsume ability. From my testing, I have found the following ways to perform one-shots. The first way is by subscribing to the channel. As I know 95% of you can't one-shot Archons and watch my videos while not being subscribed. So make sure you subscribe for everything Warframe, and while you're there, one-shot that like button as well. Anyway, let's get back to it. The frames on which I was able to perform a one-shot was as follows. First, there's Harrow, as his 4th ability is able to apply to Zata's Whisper's void damage, making them crit. Then, there's Octavia, as her metronome is able to provide extra buffs for multishot and damage on the quasses, and she has the stealth multiplier. Zata's on this build is also required for it to work. Then the other 2 best ways were with Kalervo, where I used Zata's again for additional instances, and his Wrathful Advance ability for dealing some stupid high crit damage. And finally there's Zephyr, with normal tornadoes to make sure that all of the daggers hit, and Zata's Whisper subsumed on her as well, for even more damage instances. Make sure that when you're using Zephyr and the quasses, you try to hit 2 tornadoes at once for the insta-kill. There are also some worthy mentions that worked really well, but where I wasn't able to one-shot. First is Ash with Smoke Shadow, as well as Zata's Whisper. Then there's Zaku with Wrathful Advance subsumed on them, and Dagath with Zata's as well. However, you do need to make sure that you apply Doom to the Archon before hitting them with the quasses. For all of the frames that I just mentioned, here's all of the builds in sequence, so feel free to pause the video to copy the builds over. And besides this, there will be probably many other frames that with my explanations, I might have inspired you guys to try. I also need to say that I wasn't using any Archon Shards on my frames that increased my crit damage, so perhaps some of these options will be able to one-shot once you equip some Crimson or Violet Archon Shards for extra melee crit damage. Now, using all of this testing and my newly gained insights, I've created the absolute cheapest one-shot build that I could think of. This cheapest build will require a grand total of 0 Forma, and the only thing that's required is Zata's Whisper as a subsume. And this is what the build looks like. It's Zephyr again, but this time with Funnel Clouds. Funnel Clouds creates a total of 11 tornadoes that can create new damage instances. All of the mods that you see on the build are required. However, if you really want to, you could use unleveled Nira set mods. You also don't really need preparation, but I have it to save on energy pads. The aura is highly advised if you don't have access to the dexterity arcanes. If you do have the dexterity arcanes, I would suggest using Steel Charge as the aura mod instead. For the primary, the Rata is required to build the 12 times combo before entering the fight, but you can use it without any mods. Then finally, no secondary is required, no companion is needed, no focus school is required, and you can probably use any hammer type weapon. I used the base Magistar non-incarnon with the following mod setup. Here, all the included mods are required and should be leveled to make sure of a one-shot. I specifically modded for Blast, as each Blast proc on the Archon will also proc Zata's Whisper. With 11 tornadoes proccing the Blast effect, this will make the damage instances shoot through the roof. The final thing that I need to note is that this will definitely not work in an unorganized squad, which will immediately start damaging the Archon, which will trigger the damage attenuation systems. You either need to play solo, or make sure that you communicate to your squad to not deal any damage to the Archon so you can perform the one-shot. And with that, that's pretty much all that you need to know to start one-tapping Archons to speed up your hunts. May RNG bless you all for those Tauforged Shards, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye. As always, thanks to all channel members for supporting the channel. If you are looking to become a member, please find the join button below the video.